Today's episode of Dolly Designs is going to be covering just doll stands. I make my own doll stands. My dad came up with the idea back in 2011 when I started collecting dolls again. I do have a tutorial on how I make these doll stands, like what they're made out of and alternatives and whatnot. And I also have a detailed video on me decorating them and what kinds of sealers and stuff I use. So feel free to check out those videos in my tips and tutorials playlist. And these are 7 stands. I kind of wait until I have a group of dolls because I like to work on a small group of stands in one go rather than having to like individually cut stands or waiting for things to dry. If I have a group, I can sort of paint a base coat, move to the next one, you know. And that way, if I have sort of like a creative block on one or something's not going my way, I can work on something else, build up more confidence, and come back to that. So this is kind of a random hodgepodge of dolls that we got. Some on clearance at Big Lots when it was closing. Our first Mattel Creations dolls that we got on sale online, and a thrift store find. So I hope you enjoy, and if you want to see all of the other stands I've made in the past, feel free to check out my Handmade Stands album on Flickr. You don't need a Flickr to view it, and I also have a couple videos here on YouTube in my Dolly Designs playlist. Feel free to check that out, and without further ado, let's get into it. Here I am measuring out the dowel I use as the backrest. I have sort of like standard sizes I use for certain dolls. Girls are usually like 8.5 inches, guys are usually around 9, and I am seeing if I like that for each doll because these are newer molds and some of them are slightly, the arches on their backs are in slightly different positions, whereas my original stands were made for more standard, like older Mattel dolls that use the same body molds. And I got this, I think it's 3/2 an inch, quarter of an inch dowel. That's what I use, and my stands were already pre-made. And I will usually cut my dowel with a handsaw because my chop saw that I use to cut the bases, what happens is the dowel flings when you cut it, and it can actually get caught up in the back of the saw, so we don't do that. Some people use like nail clipper type stuff for dogs to trim dowel, but this is pretty thick stuff because I want it to be reasonably thick to support the weight of the dolls. And this was the only construction part that I hadn't already done. So I use baseboard. It's like what you use for trim around a room. That's what I use for the base of the stand. And then I drill holes in it for the dowel, and you twist the dowel in, and it can twist out so you can take these apart for storage or for transport or whatever. I usually keep them assembled, but it is nice that you have that option. I always have to remember to peel off the stickers because you don't want to paint over those. And I did not film any of me like measuring the stand bases or cutting them because it's pretty loud by the saw, and I do have a tutorial on how to do it. And I actually prepped the rest of the baseboard I had left over that I bought in 2020. I got it in the scrap bin at Home Depot. I think I got a slight discount on it, which I realized that some of the molding I bought was actually particle board, not regular wood, which I didn't know that they even made it out of particle board, and I was wondering why it looked slightly warped when I was cutting it, so that was very annoying. And of course I had to sand all the primer off of them and whatnot, and here I am sanding down where I cut so it's nice and smooth. And here I am assembling the stands. You can see I'm literally just twisting the dowel in, and it goes in super smoothly, and I drill all the way through to the other side of the molding. You can see the hole comes out the bottom. Now the particle board was trickier to work with because it didn't drill as cleanly and it left like kind of bulges instead of going all the way through, so that was annoying. You can kind of see the texture difference here. That one I just did was particle board. But the nice thing is on the tiny stand that I cut for my mini Disney Cindy, where the baseboard's cut, it's a little bit uneven, so you can just extend the dowel out a tiny bit from the bottom and it balances it out so they're not a little bit tipsy on display. But these are nice and weighted, so you don't have to worry about the dolls falling over. So after assembly, before I attach the waist piece, because that's the last thing I do, I will start painting the base coats. I filmed most of it, but I had to go back and do like third coats on some of them. So what I like to do is I use acrylic paint. I mean, you could spray paint, but I have way more colors in acrylic paint and they absorb into the wood very nicely. I wasn't upset with how the particle board took the paint. It absorbed it just fine. I wasn't sure how that was going to work. These did come primed, but I sanded off because when you cut it, it's not primed on the edges, like on the sides, and it also can interfere with like the acrylic paints. I feel like it smears it around and it doesn't adhere as well. So colors like purple, I usually have to do 3 or 4 coats on. And you note I'm using cardboard to paint on. So newspaper, what happens is it'll get too soaked and then it'll stick to the stands and sometimes peel onto the stands. And my sister has silicone mats that she uses when painting, but I find that the paint sits on top of the silicone, and you can see that I have to like change the position of the stand as I'm painting the sides and the front. So if there was like a pool of wet paint there, I get a lot of like cross-contamination between the different colors, and as you can see, I'm doing like all of them in one go, and I'm moving from one stand to the other, and once I'm done the first coats, I'll switch over to the second coats. So I don't want like to wait for my protecting thing to dry between each stand. Sometimes I'll also mix my paint on the cardboard too, but the problem is it absorbs a lot of it. So today, instead of being lazy, I actually used my paint palettes, which you can tell they're really old. They're probably close to 15 years old. They're pretty crusty, but they still get the job done. And I needed actually 2 of them because I didn't want the paint to like bleed into each other, because obviously that would be really annoying if you do a base coat and then you realize another color smeared into it. So yeah, I'd say the first coat on some of these colors was pretty opaque, but just to be sure I got it all, I did 2 coats on all of them. But the purple I used for Maleficent needed 2. And also, you can tell that some of the paint is really old. There were chunks coming out of this dark green. I ended up recycling the container after I was done these stands because there was barely any left and it was pretty chunky what was still there. I mean, again, some of these paints are really old. They last a surprisingly long amount of time. I had paints that were probably 15 years old at some point and still worked, but they're really inexpensive. I think they're like 50 cents at Walmart, and I like this Apple Barrel brand. There was one gold bottle of paint from the Folk Art brand that actually went bad. It like smelled and it was completely separated. That was for the lettering, which you'll see me do later on. But the rest of it was usable even if it was a little bit chunky. So for the lettering, I always like to have a plan of what I'm doing. I've made a bunch of stands in the past, and this is just the sketchbook page I had used several years ago to make Harry Potter stands for my sister, and I also had my really old sketchbook that I had in high school that I made my original stand designs in out for reference. You can't see it on camera, but I like to kind of be inspired by the movie font, and I'll sort of make my own letters based on that. And I go over it with Micron instead of just keeping the pencil underneath. because that way it lasts, whereas when I used to just do it in pencil, over time the graphite kind of rubs off and it's hard to see. So I like to have a plan because that way I'm not just going in blind, and I can work out any issues and figure out how long the name is going to be. Sometimes I'll put the doll's like first name, like with Sirius. Other times with Voldemort, my sister already had a Voldemort stand for her playline guy, so I put Deathly Hallows. I did realize I spelled villains wrong at some point after I mapped out one of the stands for Maleficent and Ursula, so I had to go back and fix that because I didn't want to keep my spelling error in case I was ditzy and didn't catch it when I was writing it on the stands. But this is fun. I really spend a lot of time at this planning stage. Sometimes I will just go right in with paint and not map out in pencil first because the graphite can sometimes show through certain types of paint, which is one of my pet peeves. However, since I was doing 7 stands and some of this lettering was a little bit trickier, I wanted to get the space of it out first, so I just did it really lightly as I possibly could. The particle board was kind of hard to write on because it had a really weird texture to it. I probably needed to sand it a little bit more. I definitely preferred the wood, and in the future, if I ever have to buy more, I will definitely make sure I'm getting the real wood kind, not particle board, though I have a bunch of pre-cut ones for future projects that are the rest of the particle board section of baseboard, so it is what it is. But I spent a lot of time making sure that this was mapped out properly. I sped up this entire clip of me painting the lettering because it's very, very fiddly. This is sped up 8 times. I have to use a very thin layer of paint the first time, make sure my brush is clean, get a really tiny brush, which my sister has a tendency to use my tiny brushes for card making, and she's very rough on them, so I've had to ban her from using certain ones because it's hard keeping the tip super fine. So you can see that I was also taking pictures. My sister was setting things up in the dining room, so I had to keep turning my camera off, taking my lamp, and then coming back in the room after the photo was shot. So that's why there's some weird cuts. But I was convinced that this Deathly Hallows stand was going to be a nightmare and I was going to have to redo it, but it was actually one of the ones that turned out the best, funnily enough. And the gold metallic paints, silver, gold, whatever, they usually work pretty well. It's white lettering that I tend to have a problem with because this brand of white gets pretty chunky, but I wasn't doing any white lettering that day, so that was good. And I will go over and outline around the lettering with a different color, which you can see. I think that's what I'm doing on Little Cindy's stand. I just really like the way it makes it pop because it sharpens everything up. It is very difficult to get super smooth paint this tiny. It definitely takes a lot of practice, and some of it still wasn't perfect. I am a perfectionist, and it can be really annoying. So the nice thing was I had quite the selection of colors out, so I was able to use some of the main lettering color from one stand as the outline color on another one. And I also saved all of my leftover paint. I kind of stashed it in a Ziploc bag for the next day because I did not do all of this in one day. I painted the base coats one day, and then the next day I mapped out the lettering and started it, and then the day after that I did the designs and final touch-ups on the lettering, which I still wasn't happy with Cruella's stand, which is the one I'm working with here. It was really annoying, and I was very tempted to wipe it down, but the important thing is that if you do a base coat, you probably want to let it, the base of the stand, you want to let it dry, probably for several hours at least before you do the lettering, because if you make a mistake and you go to wipe the lettering off, if the base coat hasn't dried long enough, it'll peel up and then you have to touch that up. So I kind of changed my vision for Cruella's stand from what I originally had thought of when I first got my doll. I decided instead of doing a split half black half white stand like my Glenn Close doll, I would do just white with Dalmatian spots, and I only did them on the top and front because the stands are going to be like wedged between other stands. You're not even going to see the sides. Sometimes I'll do the sides if I'm feeling fancy, but this was really easy and fun to do because the spots didn't have to be symmetrical. Voldemort's stand was inspired by the snakeskin print on one of his robes. I didn't do it the exact color. I decided to go with this more shimmery green instead to complement the base coat of the stand. But this was fun because, again, it didn't have to be symmetrical. I could kind of just go hog wild. I just stuck to the front and top of the stand, not the sides like I did with Cruella's. Maleficent's lettering needed extra coats because it was done in purple, so you can see I'm doing one more final touch-up before I start the actual design, but this paint dries pretty quickly, so I didn't have to wait for it to dry before I started the design. I had a very clear vision of what I wanted to do for her design, but the lettering was just not up to my standards, so I fiddled with this first. And of course I had to do a green flame design on Maleficent's because her outfit has it at the bottom. I also did similar flames on my Disney Parks Maleficent doll. It just looks really cool against the purple. My guinea pig Flower is a huge drama queen and troublemaker, so yes, that's her. You can hear squealing in the background, always starting trouble with the other girls. So Sirius's stand needed more colors for the design because I was inspired by the print on his shirt. So I'm using a lot of the colors that were just already on the palette. They happened to work, but his was like kind of more fiddly, and I was originally going to do the top, but I decided I didn't like the way that would potentially look. Gonna look like I'm not painting anything on Ursula's because I'm using the gold that I had out for Jasmine's stand. I used that to paint some seashells, and then I'm gonna do like a little design here on the bottom, and I was inspired by Ursula's really cute little necklace, so hers took some coats to build up the opacity, and then I added in a lot of other details you'll see later on. My camera did shut off at some point, but I'm putting silver roses on Cindy's stand. It was really easy to do this design. I kept hers pretty simple. And like I said, I didn't film every second that I was painting because it's a very tedious process. I had over like 2 hours of footage to edit here, just of what I did choose to film. So I do keep going back and forth and tweaking the lettering and tweaking the designs, adding shading, to bring all the features out to life. I want my stands to be interesting, but I also don't want them to take away from the doll because the focal point is, of course, the doll. My Aladdin stands I usually like to keep pretty clean and not have tons of designs, but she has, this Radiance Jasmine has some really pretty gemstones on her dress, and I was originally going to put actual plastic gemstones, but I didn't have any in the right color, so I found these sequins, which I've had them for years, I have no idea where they came from, and I just used some super glue to put them on, and I was trying to be very careful with how much glue I applied. I didn't want to make a mess, and I made sure to space them evenly. And of course the final step, which is extremely important, is to seal the stands. I like to use a spray sealer. It makes it way easier and I feel like it's less sticky, though the tops of them do get a little tacky sometimes and stick to the doll's shoes. But I'm using this Mod Podge brand. I also have like a regular, I think it's like Rust-Oleum sealer. I've had this can for years. I was testing the spray because it had been a while since I used it in the beginning. That's why I sprayed the cardboard. But I try to do a pretty light coat. You don't want to go too thick. And I'm moving them back to that piece of cardboard and spraying the dowel too. I don't want any paint rubbing off on my dolls. And it's very stinky, but it dries pretty quickly. You do want to make sure it's dry before attempting to put the doll on it, of course. And yeah, this step brings out all the details from the paint and keeps it safe. I have used different types of wire over the years for the waist pieces. Originally, I got fenced tie wire from Home Depot. The problem with that is it's so rigid that if you make a mistake, you've wasted a piece of wire, and it comes in like pre-cut lengths. So for guy dolls or thicker dolls, there was barely enough to make the waist piece, and there'd be a pre-bent portion that was fragile, and if you straightened it out, it would break off. So then I used armature wire from Michaels, and it was a little bit too flexible. Like, you can use it, but it tended to be harder to wrap around. So then I'm like, well, let me try something else. I got this thinner wire from Walmart. It's like for gardening. It is more rigid, it is thinner. So that kind of made it harder to wrap around because I literally just wrap it around the dowel where the waist piece needs to sit. So it tended to slide up and down, which you don't want. And you'll see, I don't know why I do this. I literally will hold the doll perpendicular to the table and shake them in the waist piece to see how secure it is. Because, you know, like, that's really important. My dolls are clearly in the military or something, and they need stands that, for some reason, you can hold them when they're perpendicular. I don't know why. I expect them to be really sturdy. So you're going to see in a minute I do something else to kind of secure these into place, which was new, which I'm going to use on some old stands that have jiggly waist pieces. But this wire worked out pretty decent and was cheap. I had this very thin florist wire that I originally tried to make waist pieces for, like out of back in 2011, but I use it for headbands and stuff, and I have like a whole big spool of it still. So I do want the waist pieces to be slightly adjustable, you know, that way you can move them up and down slightly, but sometimes because you're wrapping the wire, it gets a little bit too loose and it'll just drop to the bottom, or if you pick the doll up, the waist piece will slide completely off, and that's obviously a safety issue, and that happens like no matter how rigid the wire is. It's very hard to get like a completely flush fit when you're wrapping it with your hands. And I've tried glue in the past, if you're wondering, and it just doesn't really work out. And also I'm always afraid of like the glue getting in the doll's hair if it hasn't dried right. So I crisscrossed this thinner wire. You could see in the first clip on Maleficent stand, I kind of did like an X formation and wrapped it around, and then I go on the like underneath the little thick wrap of wire, and I'll twist it with my pliers to get it really tight. So you can still, if you force it, you can move the waist piece up and down a bit, but it just adds a little extra security, because obviously, like, I don't want to have to think about these stands when I'm pulling my dolls out of them for like maintenance or photos. I want them to operate like those wire stands you can buy. I don't want I want the waist pieces to be rigid so that they hold the doll in place, but also if you need to flex them open a little bit to get the doll out without picking at the outfit, and then to squinch them back together when you put the doll in. So they need to have a certain amount of flexibility, but also rigidity. So they're not the most attractive looking things, but this wire technique took some fiddling and finesse to get right, but I was pleased with how it worked, and I was able to actually fix an old stand with it too, because I had my Jafar out for something, so I fixed his stand. So these are the stands all done. We'll start with Voldemort. You can see it says Deathly Hallows because Colleen has the other Voldemort who was sold in a 2-pack with Harry. He's like more playline. And the little snakeskin pattern was inspired by his robes. I did it in like this shimmery green instead of silver to tie in with the green stand. I didn't do it on the sides because you're not going to see those. And the sides of this are a little bit rougher because this is particle board, which is annoying. I didn't know that when I bought it, but I'm going to use what I have. And then we have the very handsome Sirius Black. So this is his stand. I took inspiration from his vest, so that's why it's kind of this warm gray with a similar pattern. And the orange dots are actually buttons, which I didn't realize when I first put them on, but I kind of like that. It's a weird print. Sometimes I'll do like the whole top and sides with the print, like Luna Lovegood. I did it all around because it was so fun, but I thought this would be kind of crowded, like it would be too fiddly to do all over the whole thing. Plus, guy dolls tend to mess up the top of their stands more because their shoes get very sticky. Then we have the lovely Style Series Cruella de Vil. I went with a Dalmatian print stand because my other Cruella, who is like the Glenn Close doll, one of them Power and Pinstripes, I did like the split stand, half black, half white kind of thing, so I decided to do red lettering. Kind of annoyed with this lettering, honestly. I don't know why. I look at it and I'm kind of like, oh, I want to redo it, but I'm going to sit on it for a while and we'll see how I feel in time. We have Villains Ursula. So her and Maleficent, part of why I made them stands, I know they're very cheapy, but I love having cool villain dolls on display. They don't sit well at all because they're so cheapy, so they're from like the same line. So you can see with Ursula, I took inspiration from the necklace, and then I pulled like some of the blue from this pattern to make the stand pop but complement. So you can see like the shells that are on her necklace, and then I took some swigglies from like the rest of the necklace. And then for Maleficent, I mean, hers is obvious. My other Maleficent also has flames on her stand, but it's like subtly different. So it goes really great with the flames that creep up her dress. It's too bad this is so cheaply made because it's actually a really cool concept. And then the gorgeous Radiance Jasmine. I got her at the same time Colleen got Voldemort. My first ever Mattel Creators dolls. Mattel Creations dolls. So for her, I didn't want to do purple because I felt like purple would be too much. So I went with gold to pick up on the gold in the pattern of her dress. And then the lettering is done in purple. And then I have like gemstone things, but I didn't have any in that exact shade. So I decided to use these sequins, which were a similar blue, to keep it simple. I don't usually like to do a lot of designs on my Aladdin stands because I just feel like they have a certain simple elegance to the artwork. And then last but not least is little Dancing Cindy, who stand I had the least idea of what I wanted to do when going into it. So it's kind of just this nice shimmery white color. It's kind of iridescent. And then I did blue lettering with the word dancing. And then because she has this cute little rose wristband piece, I did silver roses with that same shimmery green. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Dolly Designs. I have a few other episodes on stands I've made in the past, but I've made so many. I made the bulk of them before I started my YouTube channel, so you can check out my handmade stands album on Flickr. You don't need a Flickr to view it if you want to see like all of my different creations. Some of them got upgraded, some of them became different stands over the years, so It's really fun. I can repurpose them for things. And if you want to see pictures of the dolls themselves, also on my Flickr. And like I said, you do not need a Flickr to view it. And until next time, love your dolls, love yourself, and love your life.